The sun, a molten brand upon an anvil of bleached sky, pressed down on Elara with the weight of worlds, each grain of sand a burning indictment of their desperate plight. 4 days, or was it 5? Time had dissolved into a shimmering haze of heat and thirst, a relentless cycle of scorching day and chilling night, the vast indifferent desert their prison and their tormentor. Elara, barely 13 but aged by a fear that gnawed deeper than hunger, tightened her grip on baby Finn, his small body limp and too quiet against her chest, his whimpers softer now, like the last sighs of a dying bird. Beside her, 8-year-old Leah, her usually bright eyes clouded with a dull resignation, leaned against Elara's shoulder, her breath shallow, while 6-year-old Tom, his small face smudged with dirt and tears, had finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, his head pillowed on a merciless rock. Their parents, the memory was a raw gaping wound, a blur of panicked shouts, the splintering crack of a wagon wheel, and then the terrible engulfing silence as the dust storm had separated them, swallowing Ma and Pa into its ochre maw, leaving only the 4 of them huddled behind a meager outcrop of sandstone. Elara had screamed until her throat was raw, then, seeing the terror in Leah's and Tom's eyes, she had forced the sound down, locked it away with the image of her mother's face, pale and strained, mouthing, "Be strong, Elara, protect them, before the dust took her. Strength." It felt like a cruel joke when her tongue was a swollen rasp in her mouth, and the last drops from their shared canteen had been tipped onto Finn's cracked lips hours ago, a futile offering against the insatiable god of the wasteland. She scanned the horizon, a wavering line of bruised purple mountains in the far distance, so impossibly remote they seemed like a painted backdrop to their suffering, offering no solace, no hope. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the dry whisper of the wind across the dunes and the occasional unnerving skitter of some unseen creature. It was a silence that amplified her fears, making the frantic beat of her own heart sound like a drum predicting doom. She remembered Papa's stories of this land, stories of men lost and never found, their bones picked clean by buzzards and baked white by the sun. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the images away. She had to be strong, for Leah, for Tom, for Finn. Her mother's words were a fragile talisman against the encroaching despair. She tried to recall more, anything her mother had taught her about the desert plants, about finding water, but her mind was a parched landscape itself, yielding nothing but dust and fear. Her gaze fell upon a small, withered flower clinging precariously to life in a crack in the rock nearby, its petals a faded, dusty pink. A foolish thing to find beauty in such a place, yet it was a speck of defiance in the face of overwhelming desolation. A tear, hot and stinging, escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Just one, she couldn't afford more. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them, long and stark in the unforgiving light. Elara's heart leaped into her throat, a wild, trapped thing. She clutched Finn tighter, instinctively shielding him, her eyes darting upwards. A man, tall and gaunt, his face weathered to the color of old leather, shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. A rifle was cradled in the crook of one arm, and his eyes, the color of faded denim, were narrowed, assessing them with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was like the desert itself, harsh, unyielding, dangerous. For a timeless moment no one moved, the silence stretching taut. Elara could hear Leah's breath catch, a tiny, frightened gasp. She willed herself to be brave, to speak, but her throat was constricted. The man's gaze swept over them, lingering on Finn, then on Tom's still form before returning to Elara. He said nothing, his expression unreadable. He had been tracking something, the faint disturbance in the sand, the almost imperceptible signs that only a man long accustomed to the silences and secrets of the wilderness would recognize. Jedediah Stone had not expected children. He'd thought perhaps a lone, desperate soul, or maybe even the Apache raiders that were rumored to be moving through these territories, though this deep into the barren lands was unlikely even for them. But children! The sight struck a chord deep within him, a place he thought long dead and buried beneath layers of solitude and loss. He saw the girl, the eldest, her eyes wide with a fierce, protective terror that reminded him of a cornered hawk. He saw the exhaustion, the dehydration, the silent plea beneath the defiance. His own canteen, half full, felt heavy on his hip. He took a slow step closer, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements spooked wild things, and these children were as wild and vulnerable as any desert creature. He unslung his canteen, the slight slosh of water an almost obscene sound in the profound stillness. Ilara watched him, every muscle tensed. Was he offering help, or was this some cruel prelude to a threat she couldn't yet comprehend? Men in this land were often driven by desperation, by greed. But his eyes, though hard, held no malice she could discern, only a deep, weary kind of knowing. He stopped a few feet away, uncapped the canteen and held it out, not to her but towards Leah, who stared at it with a desperate, uncomprehending longing. He didn't speak. Words were often clumsy, untrustworthy things. An action, simple and direct, spoke truer. The vast, silent desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The weight of their survival, of this stranger's intentions, pressed down on Ilara, heavier even than the sun. The water, when Jedediah finally coaxed Leah to take a few sips, then Tom, who woke with a startled cry before greedily gulping, and finally Ilara herself, after she'd carefully moistened Finn's lips with a wetted finger, was more precious than gold, a sacrament against the savage thirst that had clawed at their throats. It was warm from the canteen, tasting faintly of tin, but it was life. Jedediah watched them, his expression still guarded, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the sun and by things unseen. He offered them a piece of dried jerky from his saddlebag, tough and salty, which they gnawed on slowly, their Asagira jaws working with painful effort. Ilara's initial fear of the man had not entirely vanished, but it was now mingled with a fragile, reluctant gratitude. He was a presence, solid and real in this hallucinatory landscape, his quiet competence a stark contrast to their own helplessness. He asked few questions, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Parents?" he'd asked, his gaze sweeping the empty horizon. Ilara had only shaken her head, unable to voice the terrible uncertainty, the fear that they were truly alone. "Wagon?" She nodded, pointing vaguely in the direction from which they'd stumbled, a direction that now seemed as lost and undefined as their future. He absorbed her minimal responses without comment, his mind clearly working, piecing together the fragments of their disaster. He understood the language of survival, and these children, despite their youth, bore its unmistakable marks. He knew this particular stretch of desert, unforgiving, a labyrinth of canyons and arid plains where a man, let alone a family with a broken wagon, could get turned around and swallowed whole in a matter of days. He'd seen it happen. The thought of what might have befallen their parents was a grim shadow in his mind, but he kept it from his face. The children needed what little hope they could muster. The decision to move them was unspoken but immediate. To stay here was to invite a slower, more certain death. Jedediah resaddled his horse, a lean, hardy buckskin that watched the proceedings with intelligent, patient eyes. He had to get them to shelter, to more water, and then, somehow, to civilization, though the nearest outpost, a gritty little mining camp called Purgatory Gulch, was a good 2 days' hard ride even for a man alone and well supplied. With 4 children, 1 an infant, it would be a perilous crawl. He lifted Tom surprisingly light and settled him in front of him on the saddle. Leah, he decided, could ride behind him, clinging to his belt. Ilara would have to walk, carrying Finn. It was a brutal calculation, but the horse couldn't bear more, not in this heat, not for that distance. Ilara accepted this silently. She had walked for days already. What was more walking if it led away from this sun-scorched hell? She watched Jedediah handle Tom with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, the way his large, calloused hands were careful not to jostle the boy too much. He adjusted the brim of Tom's tattered hat to better shield his face from the sun. Small gestures, almost invisible, but Ilara saw them. They moved slowly, a tiny, desperate caravan against the immense, unpitying landscape. The sun climbed higher, relentless. Ilara focused on placing one foot in front of the other. Finn's weight, a familiar ache in her arms, her mother's locket, cool against her skin beneath her dress, a small, secret comfort. She observed Jedediah. He seemed as much a part of the desert as the cacti and the rocks, his movements economical, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. He navigated by an internal compass, reading the subtle shifts in the terrain, the angle of the sun, the direction of the almost imperceptible breeze. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were spare, functional. "Rest here," he'd say, indicating a sliver of shade beneath an overhanging rock. "Drink, but only a little." He rationed the water with a stern discipline that brooked no argument, yet Ilara knew he was giving them the lion's share, his own lips often dry and cracked. As the second day of their journey with him wore on, a new kind of despair began to creep in, colder and more insidious than the initial panic. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Finn fretted constantly, his cries weak and pitiful. Leah was fading, her small face pale, her eyes large and dark in their sockets. Even Jedediah's iron resilience seemed to be strained. Ilara saw the way he looked at their dwindling water supply, the grim set of his jaw. He pushed them onward and himself with a quiet, desperate urgency. Sometimes Ilara would catch him looking at the children, especially at Finn, with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a profound sadness, a flicker of old pain. She wondered about his past, about the solitude that clung to him like desert dust. Had he lost a family too? The thought created a strange unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding of grief that needed no words. That night, huddled together for warmth as the desert temperature plummeted, Ilara lay awake, listening to the lonely howl of a distant coyote. It was a sound that usually filled her with unease, but tonight it seemed to echo the desolation in her own heart. She felt Jedediah shift beside her, his breathing deep and regular, but she sensed he wasn't truly asleep. He was a guardian, a sentinel, his senses attuned to the dangers of the night. For the first time in days, a sliver of something other than fear touched her, a fragile trust in this grim, silent man who had appeared out of nowhere, a man whose own survival was now inextricably, and perhaps unwelcomely, linked to theirs. But trust was a luxury, and hope a flickering candle in a vast darkness. The desert still held them in its grip, and its price for escape was always steep. The third morning dawned with a sky the color of ash, the sun a diffused, malevolent eye glaring through a high, thin layer of dust. Leah was worse. A fever burned in her small body, her skin hot and dry to Ilara's touch, her breathing ragged. She moaned softly, her eyes half closed, unresponsive. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's exhaustion. She looked at Jedediah, her unspoken fear reflected in the deepened lines around his own weary eyes. He felt Leah's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle, his expression grim. "We need to find shade, proper shade," he muttered, more to himself than to Ilara. "And water, soon." But the landscape offered nothing but endless stretches of cracked earth, thorny scrub, and distant, mocking mesas. The canteen was perilously light. Jedediah's face was a mask of controlled desperation. He pushed them harder, his voice when he spoke strained and hoarse. He knew they were on the edge. He'd been in tight spots before, faced death in many guises in his solitary life, but the responsibility for these children, for their fading lives, was a burden heavier than any he had ever carried. It dredged up old ghosts, memories of another small, feverish hand he had been helpless to save a lifetime ago. He had to try. Ilara, watching him, felt a surge of her own waning strength. She couldn't just be a burden. She shifted Finn in her arms, scanned the desolate surroundings, her mind racing, trying to recall anything, any scrap of knowledge her mother might have imparted about this cruel land. She remembered her mother pointing out a type of broad-leafed plant, its leaves thick and fleshy. "If you're ever truly desperate, Ilara," her mother had said, her voice serious, "the roots of these sometimes hold a little moisture. But you have to know which ones." Her gaze fixed on a cluster of low-growing plants with dusty green leaves, half hidden beneath a rock. Could it be? With a murmur to Jedediah, she carefully laid Finn beside Leah, who was now cradled in Jedediah's lap under a makeshift lean-to he'd constructed from his saddle blanket and a few carefully balanced rocks. Ilara approached the plants, her heart pounding. She dug with her bare hands, the dry, rocky soil scraping her fingers raw. Jedediah watched her, his expression unreadable, too exhausted perhaps for skepticism. After what felt like an eternity, her fingers closed around something thick and tuberous. She pulled, and a pale, ugly root came free. She broke it, and a tiny, almost imperceptible bead of moisture welled on the broken surface. It wasn't much, barely a drop, but it was something. She showed it to Jedediah, a silent question in her eyes. He examined it, sniffed it, then nodded slowly. It'll do, not much but something. Together, they managed to extract a few more roots, crushing them to yield a pitifully small amount of bitter, earthy liquid, which Ilara carefully dripped onto Leah's parched lips. It was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance against the overwhelming despair, but it wasn't enough. As the brutal afternoon wore on, a new element entered their desperate tableau, a coyote. Ilara saw it first, a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, a tawny shape against the dung-colored rocks. It stood there, motionless, watching them. Coyotes were common enough, scavengers of the desert, but there was something about this one's stillness, its direct, unwavering gaze, that felt different. Jedediah saw it too, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that leaned beside him, though he made no move to raise it. "Just a yote," he said, his voice flat. "Curious or waiting? Waiting for what?" Ilara didn't want to think, but the coyote didn't act like a typical scavenger. It wasn't circling, wasn't slinking, it just watched. Then, as if it had seen enough, it turned and trotted leisurely along the ridge, disappearing behind an outcrop. Later, as Jedediah scouted ahead a short distance looking for any sign of a pass or a change in terrain, he noticed the coyote again, further along the path he himself had been considering. It paused, looked back in their direction, then moved on. Coincidence, he told himself. The desert played tricks on a man's mind, especially when he was tired and thirsty. Yet, a strange prickle of unease, or was it something else, touched him. When he returned to the small camp, Ilara told him the coyote had reappeared briefly, closer this time, near a distinctive pile of black volcanic rocks before vanishing again. "It was looking at us," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Like it knew." Jedediah grunted, unwilling to give voice to the unsettling feeling that was starting to take root in his own pragmatic mind. Night fell, bringing a deceptive coolness but no relief from their predicament. Leah's fever hadn't broken. Finn whimpered fitfully. Tom was silent, withdrawn into a world of his own fear. Jedediah sat apart, staring into the darkness, the weight of their impending doom pressing down on him. He had one last, desperate idea, to leave them hidden as best he could, with the last of the water, and ride for help. It was a terrible gamble. He might not make it back in time. They might not survive his absence. But what other choice was there? He looked over at the huddled shapes of the children, Ilara a small, fierce protector even in her exhaustion, and his heart, a shriveled, tough thing, ached with a pain he hadn't felt in years. The desert demanded a sacrifice. He just didn't know yet who or what it would be. The only sound beyond their own ragged breaths was the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the faint, mournful cry of a coyote, closer now than before. Dawn broke grey and unforgiving, the light seeping into the vast, silent landscape like a stain. Leah was no better, her small body a fragile furnace, her breath shallow and quick. Jedediah had made his decision in the dark, lonely hours of the night. He would ride for Purgatory Gulch, a desperate, near-suicidal race against time. He was explaining his grim plan to a pale but resolute Ilara, his voice low and strained when it happened. A soft sound, a scratch of claws on rock, made them both turn. The coyote stood not 20 yards away at the edge of their meager clearing. It was lean, its fur the color of dust and shadows, its yellow eyes fixed on them with an unnerving intelligence. It wasn't threatening, not cowering, simply present. Then, it let out a soft yip, a sound that was less a howl and more like a summons. It took a few steps away from them, towards the west, then paused, looking back over its shoulder as if expecting them to follow. Jedediah stared, his hand frozen halfway to his rifle. This was beyond any coyote behavior he'd ever witnessed or heard of. Superstition was for greenhorns and old women, but the hair on the back of his neck prickled. "What does it want?" Ilara whispered, her voice filled with a strange mixture of fear and awe. The coyote yipped again, a more insistent sound this time, then trotted a little further, its gaze still on them. "I don't know," Jedediah said slowly, his mind grappling with the impossible. "But we're out of options, girl. Purgatory Gulch is that way." He gestured vaguely in the same direction the coyote was indicating. Maybe it's just heading for water and we got lucky with its path." It was a flimsy rationalization, and he knew it. "We follow it," Ilara said, a sudden certainty in her voice. She looked from the coyote to Jedediah, her eyes pleading. "Please, what if it knows something?" Jedediah looked at Leah, burning with fever. He looked at the almost empty canteen. He looked at the unwavering gaze of the wild animal. His gut, honed by years of survival, was screaming at him that this was madness. But his rational mind, the part that calculated odds and resources, told him they were already lost. What was one more piece of madness in a world that had clearly tipped off its axis? "All right," he said, the words scraping his dry throat. "All right, Ilara, we follow the damned coyote. But stay close, and if it shows its teeth, I shoot." Gathering their meager belongings, Jedediah hoisted Leah onto his own horse, cradling her against his chest. Ilara took Finn, Tom clinging to her skirt. They moved slowly, a pathetic procession, their eyes fixed on the tawny shape that loped ahead, always maintaining a certain distance, yet always waiting if they fell too far behind. The sun climbed, resuming its merciless assault. The terrain grew rougher, a jumble of broken rock and steep sandy washes. Several times, Jedediah was certain they had lost their improbable guide, only for it to reappear on a higher ridge or waiting patiently at the mouth of a narrow canyon they would surely have missed. Hours passed in a blur of heat, dust, and aching fatigue. Hope dwindled with every painful step. Jedediah began to curse his foolishness, to believe the desert heat had finally addled his brain. This was a fool's errand, chasing a ghost. And then the coyote stopped. It stood at the base of a sheer rock face, a wall of sun-baked sandstone that seemed to offer nothing but barren stone. It looked back at them, yipped once, a short, sharp sound, then, with a flick of its tail, it vanished into a narrow fissure, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Almost invisible until you were right upon it. Jedediah approached cautiously, rifle ready. He peered into the darkness of the fissure. A faint coolness, a hint of damp earth, touched his face. He pushed his way in, Ilara and Tom close behind. The fissure opened into a small, hidden grotto shielded from the sun, the air remarkably cooler. And there, trickling from a seam in the rock spilling into a shallow, sandy basin, was water. Clear, sweet water. Not a river, not even a spring in the true sense, but a steady, life-giving seep, enough to fill their canteens, enough to bathe Leah's feverish brow, enough to save them. Jedediah sank to his knees, disbelief warring with overwhelming relief. He plunged his cupped hands into the basin and drank, the water an elixir, a miracle. Ilara, tears streaming down her face, did the same, then gently gave water to Finn and Tom. Leah, after having cool water laved on her face and a few precious drops coaxed between her lips, stirred, her eyelids fluttering. The coyote was gone. It had vanished as silently and mysteriously as it had appeared. There was no sign of it in the grotto, no tracks leading away except the ones they had followed. It was as if the desert itself had manifested a guide, then reclaimed it once its purpose was served. Jedediah looked around the grotto. Near the seep, almost hidden by a fern, he saw a faint depression in the sand, the kind a nursing bitch might make for her pups. But there were no pups now, only the life-giving water. The shock of it hit him then, not just the discovery of the water, but the sheer impossibility of how they had found it. He, Jedediah Stone, a man who knew this desert like the back of his scarred hand, had been led to salvation by a wild coyote. He would have walked right past this place, never knowing it was here. For Ilara, the feeling was different. It wasn't shock so much as a profound, humbling awe, a sense that they had been touched by something ancient and sacred, a mystery beyond her understanding, but one that had undeniably saved their lives. The silence in the grotto was broken only by the soft drip of water and their own uneven breaths, a silence filled with the unspoken weight of a deliverance that defied all reason. The hidden grotto became their sanctuary for 2 days. Under the cool, damp shade with a steady supply of fresh water, Leah's fever slowly receded, the color returning to her cheeks, her eyes regaining some of their familiar sparkle. Finn, no longer tormented by thirst, gurgled and even managed a weak smile. Tom, freed from the immediate terror, explored the confines of their small haven, his boyish curiosity reasserting itself. Jedediah, his grim facade softened by relief and a lingering sense of the miraculous, used the time to let the children regain some strength. Meticulously cleaning and tending to Ilara's scraped hands and their blistered feet, he even managed to snare a couple of desert hares, providing their first substantial meal in what felt like an eternity. The unspoken bond between him and Ilara deepened in the quiet intimacy of their shared survival. She found herself talking more, recounting fragments of their journey before the dust storm, the hopeful plans her parents had for a new life in California, a place she now doubted they would ever see. Jedediah listened, his silence no longer unnerving but companionable, his occasional nods and brief questions showing he understood more than he said. He, in turn, found himself sharing small, almost forgotten skills with her. How to read the subtle signs of the desert, how to move quietly, how to listen to the wind. It was as if teaching her was a way of processing the inexplicable events that had led them here, a way of anchoring himself back to a world that made some kind of sense, even if that sense had been profoundly shaken. When they were strong enough to travel, Jedediah carefully refilled their canteens and led them out of the grotto, back into the harsh glare of the desert. But the desert no longer seemed quite so malevolent. It was still vast, still dangerous, but now it held a secret, a memory of an impossible kindness. The journey to Purgatory Gulch took another day and a half, arduous but manageable. Jedediah knew this route, and with water their pace was steadier. As they crested the final rise and looked down upon the motley collection of tents, rough-hewn shacks, and the single, false-fronted saloon that constituted the mining camp, Ilara felt a wave of emotions, relief, trepidation, and a profound weariness. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Children, especially ones so clearly ravaged by the wilderness, were a rare sight in Purgatory Gulch. Miners, dusty and sweat-stained, emerged from their diggings, saloon doors creaked open, and a few hard-bitten women, their faces etched with their own stories of survival, paused in their work to stare. Jedediah, with Ilara and the younger children trailing behind him like dusty ducklings, made his way to the largest tent, which served as a makeshift store and assay office, run by a grizzled man named Silas Blackwood. As Jedediah recounted their story, the lost wagon, the desperate days, the discovery of the children, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. There was pity in their eyes, a rough sympathy born of shared hardship in a land that offered little quarter. But when Jedediah, his voice low and factual, described how they had found the water, how a lone coyote had led them to a hidden seep, the atmosphere changed, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eyes narrowed with skepticism. A few men exchanged knowing glances, a gruff laugh was quickly stifled. "A coyote, you say, Stone?" Silas Blackwood drawled, stroking his beard, his eyes shrewd. "Led you like a dog?" Jedediah met his gaze squarely. "That's what happened, Silas. No other way to explain it. Desert fever," one man muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Sun plays tricks on a man's mind out there. Or maybe Stone's been hitting the cactus juice a bit too hard," another chimed in, followed by a few chuckles. Ilara felt a flush of anger. They hadn't been there. She stepped forward, her small voice surprisingly firm. "It's true. The coyote saved us." The miners looked at her, then back at Jedediah, their expressions a mixture of amusement, pity, and disbelief. They saw a traumatized girl, a half-wild man. The story was too fantastical, too neat. People died in the desert. That was the truth they knew. Miraculous coyotes were the stuff of tall tales told around dying campfires. The shocked everyone part of their ordeal was not the children's survival against the odds, but the outlandish claim of how they survived. It was a story that stretched credulity too far, even in a land accustomed to the strange and the brutal. A woman pushed through the crowd then, her face kind despite its weariness. Martha Henderson, the camp's unofficial doctor, cook, and conscience, her husband lost to a mine collapse years before. She looked at the children, her gaze lingering on Leah's still pale face, and her expression softened. "Never mind the coyote for now," she said, her voice practical but gentle. "These children need food, rest, and care. Bring them to my tent." As Martha led them away, the whispers followed them, a current of doubt and wonder. Jedediah Stone, the solitary prospector, had brought back 4 lost children from the jaws of the desert. That much was a marvel. But the tale of the guiding coyote, that would become a legend, debated and embellished, a story that shocked and intrigued Purgatory Gulch for years to come, precisely because it was a truth too strange to be readily believed. Under Martha Henderson's capable and compassionate care, Elara, Leah, Tom, and Finn began the slow process of healing, not just from their physical ordeal but from the deeper wounds of loss and terror. Purgatory Gulch, for all its roughness, possessed a core of frontier decency. Donations of food, outgrown clothing, and even a few crudely carved toys found their way to Martha's tent. The story of their survival, particularly the part about the coyote, became a fixture of camp gossip, evolving with each retelling. Some dismissed it outright as Jedediah's sun-touched fantasy or Elara's childish imagination. Others, particularly the older folks or those with a touch of native blood, listened with a thoughtful silence, murmuring about the desert's mysteries, about spirit animals and unexplained interventions. The children, they were the Coyote Children, a name that stuck, imbued with a mixture of awe and gentle skepticism. Jedediah Stone, a man accustomed to the fringes of society, found himself uncomfortably at its center for a time. He answered the questions patiently, never wavering in his account, his stoic demeanor lending a strange credibility to the fantastical tale. He'd check on the children daily, bringing a piece of polished agate for Tom or a rare desert flower he'd found for Leah. With Elara, he shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged in shared desperation and an witnessed miracle. He never overtly discussed adopting them or becoming their formal guardian. Such things were complex and he was a simple man, but it became an unspoken assumption in the camp that Stone was their protector. He moved his own meager camp closer to Martha's, his presence a silent reassurance for Elara. He taught her more about the desert, not just its dangers, but its subtle beauties, its resilience. He showed her how to track, how to find water in less miraculous ways, how to read the stars. In turn, Elara's presence, and that of her siblings, began to smooth the roughest edges of his solitude, filling a void he hadn't acknowledged for years. He found himself smiling more, a rustle of dry leaves in autumn, but a smile nonetheless. He was no longer just Jedediah Stone, the lone prospector. He was the man who had found the Coyote Children, the man who stayed. Elara, too, found a new equilibrium. The raw grief for her parents remained, a constant ache beneath the surface, but it was now interwoven with a profound gratitude and a burgeoning sense of strength. She helped Martha, learning to cook and mend, her hands, once scraped raw by desert rocks, becoming deft and capable. She watched over her siblings, her protective instincts still strong, but now tempered with the knowledge that they were safe, that they were not alone. She would sometimes walk to the edge of camp and look out at the vast, indifferent desert, and she would think of the coyote. It was never seen again. But its presence lingered, a symbol of an unexplainable grace that had touched their lives. She no longer felt the desert was solely an enemy. It was a place of terrible power, yes, but also of profound hidden wonders. As months turned into a year, Purgatory Gulch, against all odds, began to feel like a sort of home. Leah and Tom, resilient as young saplings, thrived, their laughter echoing among the tents. Finn took his first steps on the dusty ground outside Martha's tent, his chubby hand gripping Elara's finger. The talk of moving on to California faded, replaced by the rhythms of life in a small, isolated community bound together by shared hardship and a tentative hope for the future. Jedediah eventually built a small, sturdy cabin a little way from the main camp, large enough for him and with an unspoken understanding for the children should Martha ever decide she couldn't manage. He found a small, overlooked vein of silver, enough to provide for their needs. He was, in his own quiet way, content. He had found something more valuable than any precious metal in the desolate heart of the desert. A reason, a purpose, a family forged in the crucible of despair and rescued by an impossible act of wild compassion. The desert had asked much of them, had stripped them bare, but in its own enigmatic way it had also given. It had given them Jedediah, it had given them the grotto. And it had given them a story that would forever remind them of the fine, shimmering line between the explainable and the miraculous, between desolation and an unexpected, shocking salvation. Perhaps you've faced your own deserts, moments where hope seemed a distant mirage and the path ahead was obscured by dust and fear. What guides you through such times? Is it the grim determination of a Jedediah, the fierce protective love of an Elara, or do you, perhaps, allow yourself to believe in the possibility of an unexpected kindness? A coyote appearing on the ridge of your deepest despair, pointing a way you could not see on your own? The wilderness of life tests us all, strips away our certainties, and sometimes, if we are watchful, it reveals hidden springs of strength within ourselves and in the unlikeliest of allies. Think of Elara drawing courage from her mother's memory, her small hands digging for life. Think of Jedediah, his gruff exterior shielding a heart capable of profound commitment. And think of that lone coyote, an emblem of the wild, untamable grace that can intersect our lives when we least expect it, shocking us with its simple, unearned gift of survival. What shocking acts of salvation, big or small, have you witnessed or hoped for in your own journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience, hope, and the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding resonated with you, please consider liking this video, subscribing for more tales from the frontiers of human experience, and sharing it with others who might find a piece of their own story reflected in the vast, enduring landscape of the human heart.